je veux souhaiter bienvenue à Rufin VANRULLEN, qui est à Toulouse et qui va nous parler du Global Workspace. C'est la théorie provenant de Bernard Bars, qui a parlé dans il y a 12 ans. Mais maintenant, ça commence à se concrétiser dans les recherches de VANRULLEN, qui est directeur au CNRS, au Centre de recherche cerveau et cognition, donc CERCO, et chaire de recherche en intelligence artificielle et naturelle à l'Institut AMITI de Toulouse. On va voir, vous avez déjà vu son résumé, donc j'essaie de ça. What I didn't ask you, I'm switching to English. Rufin, what I didn't ask you was, do you not wish to be asked questions during your presentation, or do you want it reserved for the Q&A at the end?
I'm very happy to be interrupted during the presentation. Just be aware that it will take longer to get through it then.
Yeah, okay, so be cautious when you decide to interrupt about whether it's worth cutting it out of the question and answer if you can. And if it's an urgent question, do ask it. And on peut poser les questions en français. Est-ce que c'est correct pour toi?
Yes, indeed. I will speak English, but feel free to talk to me in French.
Okay, good. Well, with that, you all know we're going to hear about the Global Latent Workspace from Rufin, and he accepts to have some urgent questions asked. And the way to do it, because I won't necessarily see your hand raised, is to turn on your microphone and say something. There's too many of us to do it serially. So with that, I present VANRULLEN to speak about the Global Latent Workspace. Welcome, Rufin.
Thank you. And so thanks for these nice words and for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here. And yeah, I do apologize for not presenting in French. This is my mother tongue, but I do not know how to present science in French anymore. But I'm very happy to have discussions in French if anybody is inclined. So today what I want to do is to talk about sort of an AI deep learning architecture that we've been working on that we call the Global Latent Workspace. And as you will see, it takes inspiration from cognitive neuroscience, but hopefully it will have potential applications also in AI. So the cognitive neuroscience inspiration comes from Global Workspace Theory. You've all probably heard about this theory before. It was initially proposed by Bernard Bars in the 80s and 90s as a theory of large-scale brain organization and cognition. But also today it's being held widely among neuroscientists in particular as one of the major theories of consciousness. So in a nutshell, what the theory says is that the brain is going to be divided into modules for specific functions. So these would be, in this figure, the branches, the gray and white branches here in the periphery. So we have brain regions that might be specialized for vision, some for language, some for motor action, and so on. And these expert modules normally can function entirely independently from each other, but under certain conditions, the contents of one or two of these specialized modules, which are shown here in red, is going to be selected by an attention process, which typically is not represented on this picture, but is very much part of the global workspace idea, and I will actually discuss it during the presentation. And now these selected modules here in red will then be mobilized into a central representation, which implies that their activity is going to be broadcast, distributed, or shared among all the modules. Even those that were not selected are going to receive this information. And so the broadcast in global workspace theory is a very important property because it's the shared information at each moment in time, according to the theory. So all this global workspace here in red, which constitutes our unified experience or our conscious awareness. So we started looking at this theory from the point of view of AI, and this was about 10 years ago now. And I guess the field was a bit different also at the time. But at the time, what we thought was that, well, we have more or less the branches of this graph. We have something like the modules. We had very good expert systems for vision, for speech processing. We have very good language models, of course, and so on. And so we thought what we're missing is possibly the most important, the integration and broadcast right here in the middle. And that's what we were trying to achieve in this modeling work. So our initial idea was developed in this opinion paper together with my colleague Ryota Kenai from Japan. And so what we're trying to do here is to connect many existing pre-trained neural networks to this central global workspace so that they can start to communicate, they can start exchanging information. And for us, this connection is going to be based on unsupervised neural translation between the high-level latent space of each of these networks. So I want to unpack a little bit this idea of unsupervised neural translation. Why do we need this? Well, first, we need translation, quite obviously, because we want to start from independently pre-trained models that will be frozen. And so that means if they were trained independently from each other, that means they do not speak the same language. And so we cannot just take a latent feature representation from a vision system and just plug it into a speech system or a language system and hope that they would understand it. We first need to translate that information. Now, why does it have to be unsupervised? In practice, it doesn't have to be. We could very well train a system like this with supervision if we have a very large data set. So, for example, when we have a lot of images and the corresponding captions, we can find millions or even billions of them on the internet, then we could train this translation in a purely supervised way. But there might be pairs of these modules for which we don't have a good training data set. Maybe we don't have a good training data set for all the English speech sounds associated with particular actions. And yet there might be systematic analogies between these two modules that we would like to learn. But in this case, we have to do it in an unsupervised way. And I will show in a couple of slides how we propose to do this. Anyways, what we're hoping to achieve then, once we have all these red arrows, is that they will allow us to create something like analogies between domains, and then we'll be able to interpret these analogies, for example, as semantic grounding. That would be when the image of the tiger is going to connect to all of the associated linguistic or semantic properties. As soon as you see this image, you know it's a feline, you know it has stripes, you know it's dangerous, and all of this pops in your head without actually having to think about it. Another one of these arrows could be interpreted, for example, as what we call motor affordance. That's when the image of the tiger is going to evoke a motor plan, maybe for petting it if you're adventurous, or more likely for running away if you're smart. But there are motor plans that would be compatible with this image and some that are not compatible. You would not think of typing on the tiger as if it was a keyboard because it's just not the right affordance. And so generally speaking, we could argue that this global workspace with these analogies, affordances, with this grounding, that could be a way to create meaning in the whole system, which would be lacking in the isolated subsystem. So that's more or less our motivation for doing this work. And before I describe the work itself, I want to try to give you the full vision, the long-term vision of where we're hoping to go with these systems. But just a warning, what you're going to see on this slide is not an actual working system. This is just an illustration of how our global workspace might behave once we're done implementing it, but we're not there yet. So in this illustration, we're going to see the global workspace in blue in the center. And let's say that we can have 4 modules that are potentially connected to it. We might have a task module, and just for the sake of this illustration, we can say that the task was defined as walk in the jungle. Then we can have a language module, a movement module, and a vision module. And based on the task, the system might decide that vision is relevant. You want to keep your eyes open as you're walking in the jungle. And so vision will get connected to the workspace. And that will be represented here by these solid lines, solid red lines for connected modules, and the dashed lines for disconnected modules. Okay, so that's how we're going to set the initial stage before the task even begins. And now on the next step, let's say the task begins, and as you walk in the jungle, suddenly a tiger appears in your visual field. And because the vision module was connected, then immediately this information is going to flood your global workspace, and it will get translated into a representation that is suitable for all the other modules. Even those that were not connected, they will receive this information. So that's basically the broadcast happening here at this stage. So the translation here between vision and language, that would reflect the concept of semantic grounding that I was describing, and the connection between vision and action would reflect the concept of affordance. Now, based on the information at this stage, you remember that we have an attention system, which typically is not represented, and it's also not represented here, but it's very much part of the global workspace. And so maybe at this stage, the attention system is going to decide to connect the movement module to the global workspace. And so on the next time step, you're going to produce an escape response. And in this case, maybe you don't have to produce a language output because you really don't have anything to say. You're just going to run away. But now, what's interesting is that we could imagine a slightly different scenario in which maybe the task would have been different. Instead of walking in the jungle, you might have just been visiting a zoo. And now, in that scenario, for the exact same tiger visual input as before, your ultimate decision might have been different. It might have been to connect the language module instead of the movement one. And so you're going to say, oh, look at the pretty tiger, and you don't have to escape. So in this illustration, the reason I want to spend some time on it is that we really see the two main functional properties of the global workspace that I'm trying to demonstrate in this work and that I want to discuss today. In the first two steps, what we're seeing is that because of the idea of broadcasts, the global workspace can actually improve multimodal representation learning, and this can have, and I will try to demonstrate this, interesting emergent properties for downstream tasks. So that's what we'll cover in the first part of the presentation. But in the last two steps here, we see something else. We see how a global workspace could coordinate information from different neural networks and use this information in a flexible way to control the inputs and outputs of other networks. And so ultimately, I think this would be a much more complete model of cognition. It's something that some authors have called system to cognition, but we can just call it flexible cognition. It's less ambitious, maybe. And that's what I want to discuss in the second part of the presentation. And then, of course, you all have in mind that there might be a third function that is often attributed to a global workspace, not highlighted here, and that's the function of consciousness. Some authors believe that this is what the global workspace produces. And so I want to insist, even though we're not aiming to implement this function in this work, this is not one of our objectives. This is just about making better AI, more advanced AI, using neuroscience inspiration. Even though we're not aiming to implement it, we have to at least consider the possibility that it might come along for the ride. It might arise in one of our future iterations of this model. And so I will discuss this a little bit at the end of the presentation. But first, let's talk about multimodal representation learning. And by the way, I want to insist that compared with the long-term vision that I just showed on the previous slide, everything you're going to see now is going to be a lot simpler, right? We're really more at the level of the proof of concept, but this is just the start of this work. But don't expect too much out of it. So the first thing we're going to explore is multimodal integration. And we're going to start with just two modalities, vision and language. And we hope to find some evidence of grounding between these two modalities. So even for a simple proof of concept like this, we could actually be more or less ambitious. That is on an axis between very modest at the bottom and very ambitious at the top. If we were ambitious, we would probably construct something like a foundation model that translates between any possible image and any possible text. But we just don't have the resources to train a system like this. We're not OpenAI. So this is not what we're doing. In practice, what we did, or what Benjamin de Villers did, he was a PhD student in the lab, he created a much simpler data set to test the same idea, but really as a proof of concept. So this was called the simple shapes data set. And as the name indicates, it's made of simple geometric shapes. And we have the corresponding English description here on the right. You can see, for example, this would be a bright red diamond pointing to the bottom right. And what we're trying to do now is trying to see whether we could train a global workspace representation to learn the associations between these images and this language. You will see, by the way, that sometimes I talk about language by itself, by which I mean natural language, or typically English. But sometimes I also talk about a proto-language. And to me, this just means another type of symbolic description of the images, but instead of using words, we're going to use numbers. We can use numeric vectors that describe all of the properties of this object, and that's what I would call a proto-language, and sometimes we're going to use this instead of the true natural language. So I'll spend some time on this simple shapes environment. In more recent work...
I'd like to ask you a question about
Yes,
that.
of course. Yeah.
So this proto-language is not a translation of the English. It's another kind of a representation of the image.
Yeah, exactly. It's you could view it as a third modality. That's fine with me.
Okay, because you left aside affordability for the moment because you're just looking at language and images.
Vision. Yeah, I will talk about affordances in the next, well, after 5 or 6 slides. Yeah.
Okay, go ahead. Sorry.
All right, so in some of our more recent work, another student, Leopold, has been looking at slightly more complex environments, still simulated environments, robotic environments, where we have the image and a corresponding language or proto-language description. And we actually do have some work on scaling this up to natural scenes and natural text, but we don't have concrete results yet, and I will not discuss it today. So first we start with this simple shapes data set. And so again, this was really meant as a toy world. And so in this toy world, we have 3 possible types of objects. You can have triangles, as you can see here at the bottom. We can have these shapes with 4 sides, so diamonds. And we can have these more round shapes, egg types of shapes. And each of these objects can have 4 different attributes. They have different colors, they have different positions in the image, different sizes, and different orientations where they're pointing to. And so we can describe these objects along 3 modalities. We can view them as images. That's actually what you're doing now. But we can also describe them either with what I call the proto-language, which is really just these numerical vectors of attributes that represent all the properties of the image, or we can describe them with true English language. For example, the second one here would be a big bright green bullet pointing to the top right. And so for each of these objects, we have 3 different types of representation. And what we're trying to see is whether we could use a global workspace architecture to translate between images and the language representation. And we're going to try both types of translation, images to the proto-language or images to the natural English language. So first, let me show you the architecture that we use. This would be a simplified illustration. We're going to use pre-trained modules for each modality. So on the vision side, we have a VAE, that's a variational autoencoder, which is trained in advance so that it can turn every picture into a latent feature vector that will capture everything you need to know about this image. And importantly, this module is pre-trained and then entirely frozen while we train the global workspace itself. And then we have something very similar on the language side. We're using a transformer, a BERT, pre-trained model with a projection layer that's going to turn every caption in our data set into a feature vector. And again, this will be pre-trained and entirely frozen for global workspace training. And now we want to try to see whether we could allow these 2 modules to communicate, exchange information via a central shared representation that we call the global workspace. So in practice, what we need for this is actually an encoder and a decoder network for each modality. We need one for vision and one for language. Obviously, we do need the encoders to go from the modules to the global workspace. And we need the decoders for 2 reasons, actually. Not only to go to the other side so that we can perform a full translation, but we also need the decoders to go back from the global workspace to the initial module, because that's how, conceptually, that's how we're going to implement the idea of broadcast. For us, broadcast is the fact that from the global workspace representation, you should be able to send information to any module in the brain, including the original module. Now, in practice, when we train, when I say I train a global workspace, I'm basically training these encoder and decoder networks, which are typically MLPs, multi-layer perceptrons. And for this, we're going to apply standard deep learning with specific training objectives. And so there's different ways we could do this. Maybe the standard way or the simplest way would be to use a supervised training objective, basically translation. If I have a very large data set with a lot of matching pairs where I have the image and the corresponding text, then I can leverage this data set to train my encoders and decoders. I can start from the image, go all the way to the language side. I can compare this against the ground truth and optimize. And I can also do the opposite. I can start from the language, go to the image side, and again compare against the ground truth and optimize this. Now, it's important to realize that if that's all we do, if we're just translating left to right and also learning to translate right to left, then we're actually not enforcing a common representation in the middle, because you could learn two totally different representations for the two directions. So there's no real global workspace if that's all we do. If we want a common representation, we need something more. And for us, the something more is actually the unsupervised training objective. And so we're going to rely on a principle called cycle consistency. It's really a very cool and elegant idea. It's not our idea. We just borrowed it from language translation, but just adapted it to our purposes. And so the idea here is that if you have a lot of images, but you may not know the corresponding language translation, you can still use that to train your encoders and your decoders, because if you send your image to the global workspace and you come back, you know that you should land more or less where you started, right? And so you can use that as an objective and train your encoders, decoders. And you can even go one step further. You don't need to stop in the global workspace. You can send your image all the way to the language side. Here, you don't know if you're correct or not because you may not have the ground truth, but you can send the information back in the other direction. And again, you should land on your feet, and you can optimize this cycle consistency. So we can optimize these small cycles or these longer cycles. And of course, the same thing is true if you have a lot of text for which you don't have the corresponding image. You can use this text to optimize these smaller or these longer cycles. And so that's exactly what we do. But importantly, this training objective only needs unpaired data. So it's a lot more frugal in terms of the amount of matching data that you need. And I would argue it's a lot more like the brain, because for us, these cycles are basically the way we implement broadcast in the system. Again, for us, broadcast is the ability to go back from the global workspace to all of the initial modules, and these cycles embody this ability. So that's the architecture and the way we train it. Now in practice, let's see how it works. So on these curves, what you're going to see is each point is actually a different model that we trained until convergence, and we're just going to measure their performance on the y-axis here after training. And we're comparing always with the two colors, two versions of the same architecture. There's a version in blue that doesn't have a global workspace because it's trained in a standard way. It's trained with full supervision, and as I've explained, it means that there's no real broadcast in the system. And then in red, you see another version, the same architecture, but it has a global workspace because we also trained it with unsupervised objective, and so it learned to broadcast information from the workspace back to the input domains. And as you will see, this is really going to help the translation. So we have these two types of translations that I've mentioned before. We can train to translate between images and this proto-language, these numerical vectors, or from images and the true natural language. And in addition to the simple shapes environment, I'm actually showing results also from the other robotic environment, which I have not described yet, but it's just to show that these findings are quite generic. We always find more or less the same result in every environment. So for each plot now, I'm showing here on the y-axis, the translation error, so lower is better here, as a function on the x-axis of the amount of supervision, so the number of paired samples that we make available to the system. And so what you see on the plots here is that eventually, when you put enough supervision, and it's about 100,000 samples, then even the standard system in blue is going to manage to translate very well, right? But what you see also is that with the global workspace, you can get more or less the same accuracy with a lot less supervision. It's about 20 times less in this case, 5 times less here, 4 times less here, and on average, it's always roughly between 5 and 7 times less supervision. So what you see here is that we can build a multimodal representation a lot more efficiently when we use this sort of broadcast idea. But what you're going to see now is that we can also use these representations for downstream tasks in a more efficient way. And I'm going to show this now with reinforcement learning. And now moving to the second environment, the robotic environment, but it's really the same idea as before. We can train a global workspace system, just like I've explained before, to learn the analogies between visual inputs that I'm showing here from the point of view of the robot. So there's a camera mounted on the head of the robot. Of course, this is all in simulation, by the way. It's not a real robot. And so we translate between these images and this proto-language description of the robot and its environment. And then we can compare our global workspace system to a baseline system called CLIP. You might have heard about CLIP. It was introduced a few years back by OpenAI. And CLIP is a system which only learns to align the two domains in a supervised way, but it doesn't really have broadcast because it doesn't have the ability to send information back to the input domain. So we're going to use it as a baseline. And so once we have these two multimodal systems, we can train a reinforcement learning agent on top of them to perform a very simple task, which you will see here at the top, a simple task in which the robot has to look around, find a table, move to the table, and then it will get the reward. So I'm going to show you now in the movies on the top, I'm going to show you the performance of the robot. First, in the situations that the robot was trained. So here they were trained to solve the task based on the numerical inputs in the black box. So we can run through some episodes. You'll see each time the table is at a different location, the robot has to find the table, move to it, and will get the reward. The screen will turn green. That means that the episode was correct. And you see both systems have learned to do the task fairly well. But now, what I'm going to do at the bottom, I'm going to take these two systems out of their comfort zone, and I'm going to test them on the other modality. So suddenly, we're showing them a camera image from the point of view of the robot for the first time instead of these numerical inputs, and we ask them to apply the same strategy as before. And what you see hopefully here is that the Global Workspace agent is getting the reward just as well right off the bat. So this is called zero-shot transfer. We're not retraining it, but the CLIP agent is really struggling. It just cannot perform the task anymore. So there's really something special and useful about the Global Workspace multimodal architecture with the broadcast property, because that's really what's missing here in the CLIP system. It doesn't have the ability to broadcast, and there's a price to pay for that. So that was for grounding between language and vision. Now, as Etienne asked, I can talk about another pair of modalities, vision and action. And so in this case, grounding is also called affordance, but to me, it's really the same idea. It's learning the association, the contingencies, let's say, between these two modalities. So now we want to train a global workspace not to associate images with language, but images with actions. And so for this, what Nicolas Kousque did, he was a postdoc in the lab for some time, he tried to find a suitable environment. And so he landed on this obstacle tower environment, which is shown here in the video at the bottom. It's really a bit like a video game. You can see the agent has to navigate, has to find a doorway, and when it goes through the doorway, it will get bumped up to the next level, and then it has to keep finding doorways and to climb as high as possible in this obstacle tower. And so what we did is we started from a pre-trained reinforcement learning agent that we got off the shelf. It already knew how to solve the task, and we used this agent as a teacher so that we could collect a lot of data for our global workspace, a lot of pairs with the image and the corresponding action. And then we're going to use these data from the teacher to train our global workspace exactly like I've explained before. So in this case, we have the same type of image module. It's again a variational autoencoder. And the action module now has only a 4-dimensional latent space because there's only 4 possible actions that the agent can take. It can move forward and backward, it can slide left and right, it can rotate left and right, and I think it can jump up or down. And so with these pairs of images and actions, we're going to train our global workspace exactly like before so that it learns the analogies or the correspondence between the two modules. And after training, what we found was that the system could indeed translate from an image to the predicted action vector, but it could also back translate from this predicted action vector back to the image domain. And that's actually the reconstructions that you see in the video here at the bottom right. That's the result of doing a full cycle through the system, going from the image to action and back from action to image. And what's impressive here is that there's a lot of compression going on there, because the image was actually compressed to just 4 dimensions on the action side. And yet when we come back in the other direction, we can recover a lot of the content, not just about the agent, but also about the arrangement of the objects in the scene, the walls, and so on. And actually, when we look under the hood inside the system, we find that our global workspace, or a global latent workspace, but not the original visual space, is organized with respect to actions or affordances. So here what Nicolas did is he sent thousands of images into the VAE, and he recorded the corresponding latent vectors from the VAE, and then he performed a dimensionality reduction called TSNE, just to visualize the space in 2 dimensions, right? And so then we can color the images according to the type of action that would normally be associated with this image. So the left actions are colored in blue, and the right actions are colored in pink. And then we can see in this space that these 2 types of images are not well disentangled in the visual space. But if we just go one step further and we send the images into the global workspace, and we do again the dimensionality reduction technique, now we see that these 2 types of images map into distinct regions of the space. So the space is now organized with respect to actions. In other words, affordances are explicitly represented inside this global workspace. So to summarize what we've seen so far, we've seen that our global workspace systems, not only they learn the analogies between the domains, but they can also have a very useful multimodal representation for downstream tasks. That was the first point that I wanted to make here. But now you remember, I want to move to the second point. You remember that the global workspace should also allow us to implement something like flexible cognition, or like system to AI, if you want to call it that. And that's what I want to discuss now. So what we need for this, it's an attention system that will select the right modules for our global workspace. And you might remember in the bars idea, I told you that this selection is very important, and I mentioned that there is a dedicated attention system for this selection. So here the question is, how could we incorporate such a system in our global workspace implementation? And this is how we propose to do it. That's all the green parts on this figure. And so our idea is based on the key query attention system, which is really at the heart of modern transformer models, but that we adapted to our purposes. So what we imagine here is that at each moment in time, the internal state of the global space is going to be turned into a query vector that describes what might be currently relevant from the point of view of the system as a whole. And simultaneously, each module, whether or not they're currently connected to the workspace, doesn't make a difference. Each module will produce a key to summarize what they're currently doing. So you have a key for the movement module, one for vision, language, and so on. And then we're going to compare these keys and queries by taking the dot product. And after a softmax operation, we'll end up with an attention score for each module, telling us whether it should be selected or not. So basically, do we open the gate or not for this particular module? And so this determines which modules will be allowed to enter the workspace at a certain point in time. But of course, I'm sure you understand, once a new module gets inside the workspace, then it will change the internal state in the workspace, and this will change our query, and possibly this will result on the next time step in a different selection, right? And so if you iterate this over multiple time steps, you could potentially deploy attention to different modules at different times to perform quite complex sequential tasks, at least conceptually. So in practice, we're going to train this attention system, all the green parts, for a specific objective. And we started with quite simple objectives. I'm going to show you 2 examples. The first one is to see whether we could learn to select from just 2 modules, which is the best module in order to achieve noise robustness. So we're going back here to our simple shapes dataset. And in addition to the trained global workspace, we now have a shape classifier that we trained to distinguish between the 3 object classes. So it's looking at the state of the global workspace and trying to decide if it's seeing an egg, a diamond, or a triangle. It's a very simple task. So the classifier is performing 100% correct. But just to make life more interesting, what we're going to do is we're going to randomly add noise to one of the 2 modalities. So on some of the trials, we're going to add noise to the image side, and on other trials, we'll add the noise to these numerical vectors, to this proto-language, to make the task a little more difficult. And what we're hoping is that our attention system will learn to produce the right keys and queries so that it will select the module that doesn't have the noise, and therefore it should be robust to the presence of noise. So we're going to train this attention system, all the green parts here, end to end, for this shape classification objective under noise. And this is what happens. So here, what you're seeing on this graph, on the x-axis, you see all the different levels of corruption that we added, either to the attributes, the numerical language side in pink, or to the image side in green. And for each corruption level, you're seeing on the y-axis the attention score that was assigned by the trained attention system, in green for the visual module, and in red for the language module, or the proto-language module. And what you see here is that attention has learned to select the vision module when language is corrupted here, or the language module when vision is corrupted. And as a result of this, the system is basically performing 100% correct. It's classifying in all conditions because it's always focusing on the side that doesn't have the noise. So that was the first example. But in our view, hopefully attention doesn't just select input modules, but it should also be able to deploy different modules that perform different operations on the global workspace at different points in time. And by combining those sequentially, we should be able to perform different functions, let's say. So that's what Hugo decided to test. He was another postdoc in the lab, by teaching the global workspace to add two numbers, two digits. So for this, we had to adapt the architecture quite a bit. In addition to our vision module, which now just reads an MNIST digit as input into the global workspace, we have a hand-designed increment module that is going to take the current global workspace state and just add one. So that's why it's an increment. It just adds one to the current state. And finally, we have an output module that spits out the answer whenever we're ready. So our attention system is also going to be fairly different. Now we need to use an RNN, a recurrent neural network, so that it can plan over multiple time steps and it can keep track of its own history. And on every trial, the attention system also receives an instruction queue telling it what is the task to perform. So for this trial, it would be add the digit 4, but it could be any digit on a different trial. And then we trained our attention system, again, all the green parts, we trained them end to end for this particular addition task. And then we were very happy to see that it did learn the right strategy. And this is what I'm showing here. So just to show how the system works here, I'm going to show on top the decision of the attention system. So that's after training. So here, this shows you which of the three modules was selected by the attention system at each point in time. Typically, we run the simulations for 20 time steps. And at the bottom, I'm showing also the content of the global workspace, so which of the digit is currently active at each time step. And this is just a one-hot representation, so we can visualize it. And I'm giving you two examples here. In both cases, we always start from the digit 0, but the task is going to be different. On the left, we're going to ask the system to add 2 to the digit 0, and on the right, we ask it to add 8 to the same digit. So now we can try to follow what happens in the system step by step. At the first time step, attention will always select the input module. And so the digit 0 is going to be read into the global workspace. And on the next time step, now attention will select the increment module. So the 0 in the workspace becomes a 1. And we do this twice in a row so that the digit becomes a 2. And then we select the output module in this case, and we spit out the correct answer, which is 2. But on the right, we don't stop incrementing at 2. We just keep incrementing 8 times in a row before we finally select the output module. And that's how we give the correct answer, which is 8. So in other words, it looks like the system has learned to deploy the right modules in the right sequence in a task-dependent way. It's performing addition. And something else, I'm not showing it, but I'm just happy to report it, is that we were surprised to see that if we only train the system with instructions up to 7, so we train the attention system, but we never show digits 8 or 9, for example, and then after training, we show it a new instruction for the first time. We tell it add 8. Somehow the system still works. It figures out that all I have to do is increment one more time, and then it can add 8, even though it has never actually learned to do this. So there's a form of generalization also in the system. So in other words, even though I have to apologize. I didn't show the results in too much detail because I want to move on to the final part of the presentation. But we do have some preliminary evidence that our global workspace can also serve to adapt its behavior to the situation in a flexible way. So something like system to AI or flexible cognition. So these are the two functional properties that I wanted to demonstrate for our global workspace. But in the literature, you know, and you probably all have in mind that there's a third function that we often assign also to the global workspace, which is consciousness. And that's what I want to discuss now. So is our global workspace implementation conscious, or more generally, could any AI system ever be conscious? You probably would all like to go out of here with a yes or no answer, but I'm not going to give you a yes/no answer. I apologize. And that's because it's actually a very complex decision. We don't have all the parameters figured out. And one problem is that it actually depends on your own personal beliefs. And I cannot decide for you. I can tell you what I believe.
Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
Would you be willing, since you're about to move to another topic, would you be willing to at least sample?
Absolutely.
There's some questions at this
Yeah,
point.
let's take questions.
Okay. Sois ici, sur place. Anyone, please raise your hand if you want to. Okay, if you want to ask a question from Rufin before he goes on to this second phase. Okay, it looks like everybody's satisfied.
Or
Go
we'll
ahead.
keep all the questions for the end. That's fine.
Okay. Go ahead.
Yeah. So the point I'm trying to make is that there are many different, let's call them metaphysical stances on consciousness, and each of them is more or less compatible with artificial consciousness. And so it depends which one you would personally favor. My personal favorite is computational functionalism, just like many cognitive scientists today, many neuroscientists, but it's not the only one out there. And again, I cannot decide for you. So computational functionalism, by definition, is the idea or the thesis that implementing computations of a certain kind, the right kind, of course, is going to be both necessary and sufficient for consciousness. Even if you take this view of computational functionalism, there are still some people who believe that this computation, whatever it is, will only give rise to consciousness in humans, or at least in biological brains, and that you cannot replicate it in silicon AI. And that is what I would call the narrow view on AI consciousness, or the narrow view on computational functionalism. And so according to these people, the answer here would be no, at least for silicon-based AI. But there are other people who take this computational functionalist view a lot more broadly, and who believe that, yes, as long as you isolate the right computation, then some form of consciousness should emerge. But that's not the end of the road, because even if you conclude that theoretically, yes, it might be possible, whether or not current systems or future AI systems are likely to be conscious, well, this is going to depend on what is the right computation, and nobody truly knows, and we have many, many candidates for this. We have many theories of consciousness. There's global workspace, but there's also higher order thought theory, attention schema theory, and many others. And so it boils down to which theory you personally favor. So if we assume one very specific stance, which is broad computational functionalism, and taking global workspace theory as our preferred candidate, then yes, maybe today's results speak in favor of AI consciousness, but that's not the only possible stance out there. So this is really an open question. Now, does that mean, because this is my personal preference, does that mean I believe the models that I showed you before is conscious? I would definitely say no for now, and not yet, because I think right now, as I've said, it's a toy model. This is just a proof of concept. Everything is too simple. The modules are too simple. The workspace itself is too simple. The attention system, everything is way too trivial. But the question would become a lot more pressing in a couple iterations once we start putting many more modules together, maybe an embodied agent, and so on. And that's why I think it's important to ask this question now, before it's too late. So before addressing the question for global workspace, I also want to turn it to other more standard AI models, basically LLMs, which are the most prominent models, AI models out there today. And I cannot ask directly whether LLMs are conscious, because we don't have a good test for consciousness. I wish we had, but we don't have one. But what I can do is ask how they understand the symbols that they manipulate, how they give meaning to these symbols. And for current language models, the answer is very clear. Their meaning or their understanding is based entirely on what is called distributional semantics. It's a term that comes from linguistics. So when an LLM is producing, for example, the word or the token chocolate, it's doing this because it has learned in a very large training data set, it has learned the distribution of occurrences and co-occurrences of this word with other words or tokens. So it's entirely based on this distribution, which includes, of course, higher order statistics, but it's still a statistical distribution. Now, in contrast, we can ask how humans understand the symbols that they manipulate. And when a human is producing the word chocolate, of course, they still have access to something like distributional semantics because, humans have read text about chocolate and they've heard stories about chocolate. But in addition, they would also derive the meaning from associations with other modalities. We can see the chocolate, we can touch it, we can smell it, we can remember that our grandma used to make delicious hot chocolate and so on. And all of this collectively is called referential meaning, or more simply, it's called grounding, right? And so this grounding, my argument is this grounding is present in our global workspace models almost by construction, but clearly it is lacking in current LLMs. Now you might argue, yeah, okay, but the problem now becomes a bit more complicated because recent models are not just language models, but they started to augment these language models with new modalities. So now we talk about LMMs, large multimodal models, instead of LLMs, and maybe that's a form of grounding. Maybe these LMMs have something like referential semantics. And to answer this, what we need to do is go and look under the hood at how these systems are trained. And today, all of these multimodal versions of the LLMs are actually built starting from a pre-existing, pre-trained language model, so a standard language model trained by looking at the distribution of tokens. And then when people want to add a new modality like action or vision, then they would just train an adapter network that is going to create basically new tokens for the new modality. So it's as if we're trying to find words to describe the images to the language model. And I think we can agree that this is not really grounding. You cannot build grounding on top of a pre-existing language model because then it's all distributional meaning again. You need to build language on top of grounding if you want it to have a true form of referential meaning. Now, why do I put so much weight on this idea of grounding or affordance or referential meaning in the context of consciousness? That's because I think grounding is actually one of the major components of what we can call phenomenal consciousness. If you remember this picture from earlier, well, as soon as the tiger enters the global workspace and broadcasts to the other modules, by virtue of all of these connections, all these learned associations, the representation is going to acquire all of these referential properties. It becomes a unified representation. There is obviously a form of richness of content in this representation. There is intentionality, meaning that the representation is about something in the world. There are sensorimotor contingencies being represented there. And you can view this shared representation as a multimodal survey of the agent's world. And the reason I'm listing all of these properties here is that each of them has actually been put forward by different authors as a key property of conscious phenomenal experience. And the point I'm making is that our global workspace has these properties by construction, whereas current LLMs and even the multimodal versions don't have these properties. And that's why I think they're very unlikely to be conscious. But the question remains open for models based on global workspace. Again, not the types of models that I presented in the first part of the presentation, but maybe future versions of these models. And so we'll stop here and now be very happy to take any questions on any of these parts.
Okay, first of all, I want to thank you because that was I don't say this very often, but that was a superb presentation, and also the thinking, even though I personally, it doesn't matter, but I personally disagree with some of the things you say. I think you did a wonderful job supporting them and very clearly thought out and anticipated. Now, Dave Saint-Amour Dave, tu veux poser une question? Dave?
No, sorry, that was a mistake.
Okay, that's
No question. It was, thank you for the talk. It was really clear. Really enjoyed
Thank you.
it. Thanks.
it usually takes a little while for the questions to get bold enough, so I have to start usually launching it. Let me say that you said that so far these are toy models, and you said the absolute truth, they are toy models. Toys, both in their individual components and in, let me turn on my face, I shouldn't be anonymous. Ok. Christian, tu veux que j'arrête? Tu peux prendre la relève. Wait, your microphone is off.
Oh, pardon. Non, non, vas-y, continue, je peux attendre.
Okay, c'est pas, non, ok, je pose une question et puis je te passe. The question is, everything, and you also did an excellent job in saying how this is not something that an LLM can do or an extended LLM can do. This is something quite different. It really is motivated by the idea of this interconnectedness. But it's still, and it's not, and I think you'll agree, it's not the interconnectedness of words, but more. But what about that more? This is the simple question, how does your prevision of what really will be, I hate the weasel word conscious, but anyway, I'll use it, of a system that really will be conscious, along the lines that you're describing over here, how will that overcome the fact that it's all just components in the world? Do you think, for example, that a Turing test that is not just words, like the standard one, but a Turing test that is an actual robot, a real robot, and if you're very with the population that you mentioned that is skeptical if it's not in a human body, if we go even further and we take a Turing test in which it's not only a grounded robot that can go into the world and do anything that a human can and say anything that a human can say about it, but in addition, on the inside, to the extent that it's necessary, there's some biology that's also added. Fine. With that, you think that you've captured consciousness or just the functional side of systems that have consciousness? Do you recognize that to even be a distinction?
Yes. So this is possibly the most difficult question you could ask, and I will admit that I don't have the answer. But yes, we don't have a good test for consciousness. The Turing test was not a good test for consciousness, but of course there was no way to know this 80 years ago. Some people have proposed an embodied Turing test, and I think this goes in the right direction. But still, in the end, as you said, you will never know, and I don't know how we can ever know whether we're just implementing the functions. So are we just looking at a zombie, a philosophical zombie, or is there something inside? I don't know if we'll ever be in a position to fully address this. And we might have to accept at some point that this is just a matter of personal belief. If you believe in computational functionalism, and then the right functions are being implemented in the robot, so it's not just about how it behaves, but you know what's going on inside, you know how it was programmed, then you might have to say, well, I personally believe this robot is conscious, and somebody else might disagree, and maybe that's the most we can ever do. It's pessimistic, but...
The current way to say that is that it is indeed a hard problem. Now I give it to Christian Lebière, in English or in French, whatever you like.
I will go with English. I mostly forgot how to speak French, or at least technical French. So you mentioned your system a few slides ago as a system to cognitive architectures. Again, of course, cognitive architectures have a long history since Newell proposed the concept about 50 years ago. And there have been a number of very different cognitive architectures attempted on the spectrum, from symbolic to neural and hybrid. There were some recent papers, since you mentioned System 2, about how various architectures relate to the System 1, System 2 dichotomy. And there've been even an effort recently to try and unify some of the principles learned in various cognitive architectures under the moniker of common model of cognition. Are you familiar with that kind of work generally, and do you see it as being relevant to your efforts here?
Yeah, so I don't know the common model of cognition. I'm going to look it up as soon as I hang up. Yeah, so generally speaking, I mean, I think there's nothing magic here. Maybe what I could say is special here is that it's inspired by Global Workspace. So not all of these systems are, but they do have similarities, right? It's not the first time also that the cognitive architecture was inspired by Global Workspace. I think Murray Shanahan was working on this and in the 90s, and there's been another attempt with Bernard Bars as an author. I forget the name of the architect. Was it Lisa? No, it wasn't Lisa. It was something fairly similar. I think the difference is that this is a modern deep learning approach on these types of architectures, and that it's inspired by Global Workspace, but it's probably not incompatible with other things being done. Yeah, there's nothing magic in this architecture, I would say.
Yeah, and I should mention, so some of us involved with the common model of cognition, in particular, John Laird, Paul Rosenblum, who presented in this series before, and Andrea Stocco, had a recent paper trying to map the various theories of cognition, of consciousness, including global workspace, onto the common model of cognition. So that paper may be of interest to you. If you can find it, email me and I can send you a reference.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Good. Let me see if there's anybody who's bold in this locus. Est-ce qu'il y a quelqu'un qui a une question, une observation à partager? Laissez-moi, ne me laissez pas dans la situation où je suis le seul Yo. Vas-y.
C'est une question en français, si
Allez.
en français. Merci Rufin pour ta présentation. Je voulais revenir, je crois que c'est l'une de vos premières slides qui vous montre que du coup, vous montrez que votre recherche elle est à l'étape de preuve de concept et où les expériences que vous avez faites, c'est sur enfin, les données, c'est soit effectivement du proto-langage, enfin, en français, comment on dirait du coup?
Langage.
Proto-langage, ouais, ou du langage naturel. Mais c'est vrai que, enfin, si on en revient à la conscience humaine, c'est beaucoup plus complexe pour nous. Dans l'un des articles que vous avez mis en référence, vous mentionnez un exemple sur la question de l'art, de faire correspondre des modalités qui sont très différentes, tel un tableau, par exemple, impressionniste avec un poème de Baudelaire. Et là, il y a une dimension esthétique, il y a une dimension émotionnelle. Et vous parlez de la pertinence de peut-être ajouter des modules limbiques, enfin, comme un système limbique dans le cerveau. Et moi qui viens de neurobiologie, je me suis toujours demandé, parce que j'ai pas encore de réponse, donc si vous pouvez m'éclairer sur, enfin, en machine learning ou en deep learning, comment vous, conceptuellement et en termes d'implémentation, qu'est-ce que vous entendez par système limbique? Comment vous comptez, enfin, est-ce qu'il y a des recherches pour modéliser ça? Parce que c'est le type d'expérience qui est effectivement au-dessus de la preuve de concept.
Je peux comprendre. J'y ai pensé un peu. Alors j'avoue qu'on n'a pas, on s'est pas lancé dans cette implémentation. Je pense que en première approximation, ce qu'on pourrait faire, c'est juste ajouter un système qui décide, qui permet de classifier si la situation dans laquelle se trouve l'agent correspond à tel ou tel type d'émotion. Par exemple, est-ce que c'est une situation dangereuse? Est-ce que c'est une situation triste? Est-ce que c'est une situation joyeuse, etc. On pourrait considérer que ça, c'est un système émotionnel. Alors, ça paraît peut-être un peu trop simpliste. On se dit, oui, non, mais les émotions, c'est pas juste qu'on les détecte ou on les catégorise, mais on les ressent. Mais pour moi, c'est un peu la même chose que de dire j'ai la capacité pas seulement à classifier des objets, des images ou des couleurs, mais aussi à les ressentir, à en faire l'expérience. Et c'est justement la différence entre un module de vision et un Global Workspace connecté à un module de vision. Le module de vision, il décide de ce qu'il y a dans la scène. Et le Global Workspace connecté à ce module de vision et à plein d'autres modules, lui, il en fait l'expérience, entre guillemets. Donc si on accepte ça, je pense qu'il n'y a rien de magique à avoir, ou rien de mystérieux à un système émotionnel. Dans ce sens-là, on pourrait avoir un système qui décide, qui classifie la situation en termes des émotions. Par exemple, ça pourrait être les 6 émotions standards, ou ça pourrait être juste positif, négatif en termes de valence, par exemple. Et ce système serait connecté au Global Workspace. Et on pourrait penser que c'est le Global Workspace qui, par cette connexion, peut avoir des jugements esthétiques, par exemple, des jugements de valeur ou des jugements émotionnels. Alors, encore une fois, on ne l'a pas fait, mais je pense qu'il n'y a rien qui empêche de faire ça.
Alors, l'idée, c'est la slide que vous avez montrée où vous avez fait un de vos postdoctorants, la réduction de dimension, le TSNE. Vous montrez que dans l'espace latent, il arrive à mieux discriminer les images. Pensez que sur des choses plus complexes comme les émotions, ça pourrait le faire avec
Ouais,
un
en
espace.
quelque sorte, ouais, si le système était connecté à un système émotionnel, on devrait en tirer dans la représentation latente du Global Workspace une séparation entre différents stimuli ou différentes situations qui correspondent à différentes émotions. Et donc on pourrait penser, s'il y a une expérience à l'intérieur, je dis pas qu'il y en a une, mais s'il y a une expérience phénoménale à l'intérieur phénoménologique à l'intérieur du Global Workspace, dans ce cas-là, il y aurait aussi une émotion associée à cette expérience.
Ok. C'est parce que c'est votre vue, on va dire, computational functionalist.
Tout à fait. On n'est pas obligé de l'accepter. Dans ce cas-là, il n'y a rien, il y a rien à l'intérieur, c'est juste un zombie. Mais un zombie connecté à un système limbique.
Okay, I have to describe the constraint satisfaction problem here, which is that what I notice is that if we switch entirely to French in and French out, we lose people. So could we balance it by saying that you can ask your question in French, but you should restate it and answer in English?
Indeed. Apologies. I'll do
Okay,
that for the next one.
And I have one again, which is how do you, an extension of what you said before, how do you imagine the generalization? You said that the Turing test is inadequate, and certainly the verbal version of it is inadequate, but how do you imagine a generalization of your specific functional approach to the robotic version of the Turing test, not the third one with the biology, but just the capacity to do everything that we can do as a zombie? How do you see that extension working?
Yeah,
Because
so what I was pointing out is that other authors have proposed something like an embodied Turing test because it was clear that language is not sufficient. My point was actually that I don't think that's going to take us very far. It's going to, I mean, it would be something that current models do not pass because right now their embodiment is very bad or very poor. But a lot of companies are working on this, and I'm sure there's going to be a way to solve the problem, possibly just by scaling the model size and the training size until they manage. I don't think behavioral tests is ever going to answer satisfactorily this question of is there consciousness inside.
but I said no, forget about consciousness. Do you think your approach generalizes to zombie robotics, and not just zombie robotics that the companies do in order to get a product to a consumer, but zombie robotics that attempts to solve a problem in cognitive science, which is to explain how it is that we can do all the things that we can do, including talk about what we talk about?
Yes, so 100%. That's what we're aiming to achieve actually here, right? Again, consciousness was not our objective. I talk about it because a lot of people want to talk about it. But the objective is exactly this, is to use this as a blueprint to create embodied robotic systems that have grounded representations at the center, and on top of which we can then build any potential decision system, any potential action system, including language. Of course, language should be part of it if we can, but it should be built on top of an existing grounded representation system like a global workspace. And that's what we're trying to do with colleagues from robotics, actually, in Toulouse.
And is it the system that you're talking about that is the grounding? It seems to me that it's a component of the system that you are talking about that is the grounding, which is the robotic capacity to do with words and objects what we can do with words and objects. That's grounding. The connection between what you called, I think you called it a proto-language. The proto-language is not a proto-language in that you're not doing things with words when you do things with the vectorial representation. You're simply connecting representations to representations. And this is not a consciousness issue. This is a functional issue.
Yeah, but so language, proto-language, these are not exclusive, right? I can, and this is what I'm trying to say here. So, I've shown only examples with 2 modalities, but now we have versions of the global workspace with 3 modalities where both the language and the proto-language are being connected together with vision. And we want to move to including more modalities, action, and so on. And in the end, if it's just a system that connects representations to representations, I think as long as it does it in the right way, I don't think I'm any different. I'm probably just a system that connects representations to representations.
You're different. You're a robot. You can actually connect your hands to objects.
Well, but I don't control my hands. I control neurons that, eventually move my muscles. And these neurons, they're just representations. I can represent them by vectors that are active or inactive. I mean, I don't see the difference.
Is movement a representation or something other than a representation?
So you're talking about output, motor output. I think motor output is also just another kind of representation. I can have a system that outputs decisions, and these decisions could be used to control a hand, they could be used to control a language system, they could be used to create an image. And I don't think fundamentally that there is a difference here.
Okay, look, I've praised you, and I can only praise you for what you've done and said. We will not arrive at an agreement on this, and there's lots to be said. I'm asking for the last time the people who stayed and were not driven away by the French, or the people who speak French here but who'd be willing to have an English answer. Last call. David, go ahead. Good. He'll be a speaker later in this series. Go ahead, David.
Okay, it's just really a minor question. Well, you tell me how minor it is, but you rejected the idea the LLMs, the multimodal ones, really get proper multimodal integrated information working. And I think I agree with you that there's a lot of missing with the current approaches, and that they don't really get everything we would like. But I don't think you said, or maybe I just didn't hear it, why you think exactly that they are insufficient. Is it because, for example, that they have to do it in terms of tokens? Or is it because it's post hoc, you train the whole LLM and then you add something additional afterwards? So is it about the order, or is it about the tokens, or maybe both, or maybe something else about the training process? That's what I want to know.
No, I have nothing against tokens because, again, these are just representations. These are vectors of numbers. And as I've argued, I think that's neural activity patterns. It's really what you said. It's about the order. You start from a pre-existing language model. So at the core of your system is a distributional semantic type of representation. And then you're trying to add components on top of it. But you cannot change what's at the heart of your system if you didn't the system.
Thank you.
Anybody else here? Okay, with that, I don't know. It's when we have a really excellent talk like this, why does it generate less questions than less excellent talks? That may have been your mistake, Rufin.
I will take it as a good sign then. Thanks a lot.
Okay, so many thanks, and come back again, because these topics are being discussed all the time at this time slot, if you're able to do it.
Yeah, I'll try.
Okay, with that, I declare this seminar closed.
Thanks for having me. Bye-bye.